Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome. This is another special edition. This is Nick, and I'll be hosting a show called The Takedown, and we're going to start basically bringing content to you the first Monday of every month moving forward. So, without further ado, since we're running a little bit late with technical difficulties, I would like to go ahead and introduce Professor James Galbraith. And basically, we're going to have a general conversation, but Professor, I would like for you to kind of introduce yourself to our audience.
Well, hello. It's nice to be with you. I'm James Galbraith. I'm a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and I do work on a number of economic policy questions from inequality to the current state of Europe.
Amazing, amazing. I know that you do some very, very, very good work. I think I've read a multiple, and I'm starting on, I think it's your second to last book. I know you just released Welcome to the Poison Chalice, and that's going to be focused a little bit on Greece. And I think I started to read Inequality, Everything You Need to Know, but I've also read The End of Normal, and I've read, there was one more. Can't remember. The Predator State.
Now, this year's been a bit busy, or last year was. I have two books that appeared this spring. One was called, as you say, Inequality, What Everyone Needs to Know, which is part of an Oxford University Press series. And then I published a book just this last few weeks called Welcome to the Poison Chalice, The Destruction of Greece and the Future of Europe, which is an account of the work I did attempting to assist the Greek government in the first 5 or 6 months of 2015.
You know, what actually brought me around to starting to look at you've got a vast body of work. You speak at a lot of places, you give a lot of interviews, and I want to first off thank you for agreeing to come onto our platform and to kind of, bring your message and what you have to say to our audience here, because I think really we can benefit from what you have to say. I want to start the conversation off where I remember you started to discuss, and your name has been mentioned when they were talking about the insularity of the economics profession in general. And I remember you spoke about, in The End of Normal, you spoke about different factions. Could you kind of explain, a little bit about that? Like, there's different factions within the profession, and kind of explain, what the major dominant ones are, and then, kind of just give us a brief rundown of each, and maybe like a notable name or two that comes to your mind when you think about it.
Well, economics is a study of human societies, and it is a subject which is historically defined by ideological positions and divisions, and that remains the case today. Although it's fair to say that in academic economics, there a very formalistic and conservative tradition is dominant and has been for a generation. It is still the case that there are substantial dissident viewpoints, alternative viewpoints, and the subject is evolving. So what I try to do in my book, The End of Normal, which is a discussion of the aftermath of the great financial crisis, is to review not all, but the major themes that were explanations that were offered by different schools of economic thought. Some of them said, well, this is just a statistical accident. There's nothing to be said about it, nothing to be done. It was something nobody could predict. And there were others who said, well, actually, it was quite possible to predict it. There were certain clear indicators, and those are signs that the market system doesn't work as well as you say it does. And there were several different variations within that general framework. So I lay out in the book how these different viewpoints are framed, and I try to also express how I think the direction of economics ought to evolve in the future. What topics in particular it does not take good account of that it should do a better job with.
Now, for our audience, what was key is what you said right at the beginning. You said that basically, as far as the mainstream or what's talked about in public discourse or what's shown on TV, has mainly been a strong lean towards the conservative end. I mean, I believe some people used to call it supply side. You know, this is going to be the Chicago school and their ilk from the, I guess, the older generation. Maybe somebody else or new schools have inherited that torch, you know, per se, and have carried it on. But kind of, you know, that is actually separate from the vast body of work from the academic profession, correct?
Oh, I'm not so sure. I think the Chicago school has become much more influential in academic economics than it was 30 or 40 years ago. What basically happened coincides with the change in the political climate in the United States. From the early middle 20th century, the middle third of the 20th century, the 1930s into the late 1970s, there was a broad consensus in the United States and in the world that a functioning economic system needed a strong government, needed well-run trade unions, and needed what my father in a book in 1952 called countervailing power. And that you really needed to have regulations that advanced the public interest, and that kept the market under a reasonable degree of control in order to protect the environment, in order to protect consumers, in order to protect workers, and against a whole set of very well documented problems. Well, after about 1980, the mainstream in American politics and in American academic economics took the position that regulations had become burdensome, that the costs exceeded the benefits, and that the market could regulate itself, and proceeded to attack and in many cases dismantle the regulatory structures. Not everything that was done there was bad. There were some regulatory structures that were obsolete and could be safely removed, but there were others that were essential, including especially financial regulation. And when financial institutions are deregulated, they tend to get the system tends to run out of control, and it tends to open up the field for con men, sharp dealers, crooks, thieves, actually. And there were a great many of those, both in the savings and loan crisis in the 1980s and in the run-up to the financial crisis in 2007.
So at the beginning of what you just said, you actually feel like that the conservative side has actually grown. See, you know, if you follow some of these people's writings, I'm not actually trying to counteract what you're saying. I'm just saying I was actually shocked to hear that. This is a revelation to me. I figured that side would be dying because of the empirical.
Well,
a lot of the empirical data for some of their stuff.
You might think that would be the case if you were, let's say, evidence or reality-based. But academic economics really isn't evidence-based, and it isn't reality-based. It's a kind of tribal structure where, in order to advance, you have to publish in particular journals which are controlled by particular ideological factions. And so there's a very rigid hierarchy of positions and a very rigid set of rules that have come to govern access to those positions. It's not at all like the situation in the post-war period when economics departments were havens for extremely interesting and diverse people with very different scientific and methodological formations. It's all become really quite uniform. And as a result, at the moment, in the almost 10 years now since the financial crisis, when the economics profession was really shown to be clueless about some of the most important problems that the country faced, there's come to be a kind of divide between academic economics and the real world, a kind of a situation in which your economics professor simply does not want to talk about the problems that their students have been living through for their entire conscious lives. So it's a very interesting and difficult problem, I think, from a let's say standpoint of an educator, of how you go about creating an education in economics that's actually useful for people.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that theme because, you know, based on what you've said, you know, I can go and, I don't know, I have 3 textbooks here And I'm pretty sure I can grab any of those 3 textbooks and pull out, there's some things that you challenged, as to, I mean, as far as theory wise, it could be anywhere from trading off inflation and employment, or equilibrium models, and there being a normal state of growth that's always inherent in an economy. These are things that are still taught, like that's the basic 101, that every student learns growing up. And, this is something that you've already challenged. And I'm just wondering, if this really is like an evidence based or empirical based, field. Like, how does some of these things remain so pervasive
Well,
as far as like what's out there? And I know you just shed some light on that, but kind of bring that home to what does that mean to the people who are outside the field?
Well, let's just take one little example. The economics profession since the Second World War has paid very little attention to the question of resources, the cost of resources, the cost of energy, for example, the role that materials play in economic life. They focused on machinery, capital, and human input labor as the major sources of the productive process. Well, this is really quite problematic when you come into a world in which resources, and particularly energy resources, are becoming much more expensive, and it is necessary to move to more costly sources and means of production of energy. And it's also very problematic in a world in which you really have to take account of the wastage and of the emissions of the carbon dioxide in particular that's going into the atmosphere. It's causing climate change. These are not equilibrium processes. They are processes that deal with the finite and, to some degree, fragile systems in which we live. The economics profession, which is built around the notion that the market generates a stable equilibrium, essentially world without end, is not well prepared. It's not conceptually suited to dealing with problems of this kind. So what would be necessary? Well, if you wanted to start from the ground up, you would go to the natural sciences, and you would take the basic physics and mechanics of the situation, and you would build your economics on that. And that seems to me to be a sensible and plausible way to proceed. It's one of the things I talk about in general terms in my book. But if you take that conversation into an economics department, generally speaking, most of the people there, it's sufficiently unfamiliar to them that they simply think that you're not in the discipline. You're not talking economics as they understand it. So there is a great disconnect there, and it's a big problem.
And this is beyond fascinating to me, because I feel like it was coming into this before you just went and basically shed some light on that. I assumed, just like I said when I first said in the intro, I assumed that the body of work of economics was broader than what the public is actually exposed to. And it seems like that this dominant faction that we see in front of us could just be a very loud faction, but for the most part, there's a body of pragmatic work that exists outside of that. It's just not given a microphone, so we don't know about it. It's not mentioned in policy discussions, because a lot of the things that are out there in front, maybe perhaps that's what's has the most visibility, but it's not necessarily indicative of the field as a whole. You're saying quite the contrary, that it might be the main body of at least academic work, but there is actually still pragmatic work out there. It's just a lot smaller than what I had first. I assumed it was like 80-20.
Yeah.
We were only seeing 20%.
I don't want to disparage everybody who's in the field, and there's some things which people find genuinely interesting. There's this whole body that's called behavioral economics that fascinates a substantial group in the profession. But as I say, on some of the questions that I would consider to be the most important, the stability of financial systems, the interaction of economics with the natural environment, the institutional failures and the need for for codes of behavior that are effectively enforced by society, so as to prevent financial meltdowns that are based upon massive waves of financial fraud. These are areas which attract me precisely because, by and large, the economics profession doesn't choose to engage with them at all.
I see. Not to beat the horse dead, but let's kind of go into like some practical application. Of course, we're not going to get like super detail heavy, but let's just talk about things that like everybody accepts as, necessarily, you can't do this as far as policy is concerned, but actually might not be a bad idea. I wrote down a few of them that just came to the top of my mind, but let's just start with one like price controls or wage controls. Like, can you just talk about a little bit about, the pros and cons of that and what it actually means in like a non-biased way?
Well, that's something which I have a lot of background because in the immediate wake of Pearl Harbor in early 1942, the United States went to a system of price control under something called the General Maximum Price Regulation. And this was administered by an agency, the Office of Price Administration, of which my father, John Kenneth Galbraith, was the director for prices. So I grew up in, let's just say, a household which had a unique experience with the problem of wartime price control. And price control at that time was essential because without it, you would have had it would have been very difficult to manage the enormous expansion of production that was going on and of incomes that was happening in the United States economy as people were hired for war mobilization without having a runaway inflation, excess demand for all kinds of goods. And so what price controls did during the war was to keep a lid on all of that and enable people to be assured that if they put their money into government bonds, they wouldn't lose purchasing power. And that helped both stabilize the economy during the war and created a basis of financial wealth in the household sector that fueled much of the early post-war expansion. So extremely valuable and successful experience. It's much harder to have a permanent structure of price control in a peacetime environment and in a world in which there's a proliferation of different types of products, and everything is a little different from everything else. But there are some prices which are clearly still administered. The interest rate being one of them. The Federal Reserve is the agency that sets the cost of funds to the banking sector, and there was a lot of mythology about that. But what actually happens is that the Federal Open Market Committee meets every 6 weeks and decides what that interest rate is going to be. And there are other prices. The wage structure, for example, in the federal service, which is a substantial body of employment, is set by fiat. The minimum wage is set by law. And those key prices, the price of oil is another one, which is at least in part and substantially controlled by a cartel, or at least by the key member of that cartel, which is Saudi Arabia. And these prices then are taken as the basis for the cost structure in the economy. Destabilizing them is always a risky thing to do because it tends to ripple through the entire structure of costs and make life for private business very much more difficult than it would otherwise be. So we tend to believe that prices are all set by the market, but key prices, in fact, are not set by the market. They're set by social institutions that deal with that kind of thing.
Oh, Professor, I kind of lost you right there. Could you repeat that last part?
I was just saying that we tend to believe that prices are set by the market, but key prices are not set by the market. They're set by social institutions that we, in fact, do have control over.
So the belief that we actually should let the market, that first off, the false belief that all prices are set by the market and that's just the way things are, and that any attempt to change that would create some sort of distortion kind of flies in the face of reality, right? Like, I think that because we believe that, really do feel like the policy discussion can't move forward in ways that really will be beneficial to us, because there are some things, we're just talking about prices and wages right now, but there are some things that can be achieved, just like you said, right after what you said, 1942, we had price control and wage controls during that time to kind of prevent, I think you were saying, demand pull inflation, right?
Well, during the Second World War, we had comprehensive price control. And we had them again during the Korean War, and we had them again briefly for a year or so on the early 1970s under Richard Nixon. So this is not something which is alien to the history of the United States. There's the specific experience of it.
But I believe that's maybe, for a reason, right? There, just like economics is as a social construct, there are forces that, would want to use it to basically push certain policies regardless of their effects, and will either co-opt or use anything it can to make sure that that's moved forward. Just like you were saying, it'll demonize certain things regardless of what they actually accomplish or what they did, what they can or cannot do. The downsides will seem huge, and the upswings or the upsides will seem very, very small. Because I really do believe that things like controlling the market or having like a planned economy might be something we can move towards, but that's almost blasphemous in like public discourse today.
Well, as a matter of fact, there is, of course, a good deal of planning that goes on. It goes on at the level of cities. It goes on at the level of transportation networks. It is what the United States Congress is there to do, is to make legislative decisions which require thinking about what the future is. So there's a reasonable provision for the future is what we have a government to attempt to provide, and to pretend that all those decisions can be taken by a decentralized market is a formula for self-delusion, of course. But let's just talk about one narrow aspect of this, which is a problem that I work on a great deal, is the question of inequality, and particularly inequality in the structures of pay. One aspect of that is a minimum wage, and whether the minimum wage should be raised by a lot, let's say, as the current proposal and now the Democratic platform urges, from $7.25 to $15 an hour. That would have a significant effect on the structure of wages. It would give a raise to maybe 35-40% of the American workforce, depending on how close they are to that minimum now, of greater or lesser extent. But it would create a wholly new structure of wages with a substantially higher bottom end. Now, would that be a good thing or a bad thing? That's a debate that the economics profession has been having for a long time. Some people say, well, with that cost of labor, people would lose their jobs, and it's probable that some would. But the other side of the story is twofold. One is that it would greatly increase the purchasing power in families with low-income earners, and those people would have more income, they would spend more, and so new jobs would be created to meet that demand. And the other thing, which is a longer-term effect, is that when you have a wage structure like that, you tend to encourage businesses to advance their investment in productivity, enhancing activities, and that raises overall productivity and living standards. So you have a couple of effects which work toward improving living standards and improving purchasing power against an effect which works on the cost of labor. And it's the experience of countries that have pursued that policy that the positive effects tend to predominate, that they tend to do pretty well out of that, which is why I think moving to a $15 minimum wage would be a very good thing. Now that's a judgment I would make as an overall student of political economy, but it's one about a social decision, if you like, a planning decision that needs to be taken by the public, by in effect, since the minimum wage is set by the government, and it needs to be taken by the United States Congress.
I don't mean to move it in a different iteration. I had a bullet point next to where you spoke about, rents and the difference between rents and income from actually working. If you can kind of go into that and just give a brief broadside of that and what it means
Sure.
to individual people.
Sure. This is an issue in the history of economics, of political economy, that goes back to the 18th and 19th centuries. Rent is the part of your income that comes simply from owning land or some other physical asset, and earning it doesn't require that you actually do anything. So this was associated is associated with being a landlord or being a proprietor of a terrain of some kind, and the lesson of classical political economy was that since that the recipients of rent didn't really have to do anything in order to earn it, they were basically earning the productivity of the land that they owned by conveyance of a legal title, that they should be the ones who are taxed. And taxes should not fall on labor. They should not fall on capital, which is necessary for productive purposes, but they should fall on land, and that was the appropriate place from which to draw resources for public purposes. So that's the basic lesson of a classical taxation theory. I think it's a very sound theory. I think it's extremely interesting that in one major country in the world, which is China, where the government holds practically all of the land, certainly the very large majority of it even now, the cities are very well funded. And the reason they're well funded is they collect rent. So they don't have to have sales taxes. They don't have to have income taxes to any significant extent. It's very hard to do in the chaotic Chinese economy, but they can simply say, well, you want to use this factory, this office building, here's your rent, and you can pay it or go someplace else. And of course, for high-value properties, people pay a lot. So that's how Shanghai finances itself, and that's why if you go there, you will see that the infrastructure has expanded out to an extent which is just extraordinary to the eyes of anybody coming from North America or Europe. So it does work as a model, and it is a sensible way to proceed to try and place the burden of taxation on that fixed asset land. Instead, what we're doing, and what the Europeans are doing, is taxing sales, value-added taxes, which is cumbersome and extremely regressive. In the U.S., we have a very complex structure of taxes, but we specifically minimize the taxes on land because of the extraordinary influence of landowners in the making of these laws. Texas, for example, has a constitutional ban on a property tax at the state level. Why is that the case? Well, the Texas Constitution was written by property owners. It's not a surprise.
That is actually incredible. I didn't actually know that about Texas, even though I live here.
Yeah, and it's not the only state. I don't have a full list, but there's certainly common practice.
I guess so. You said something else, a value added. Our taxes added on. You said value added. There tend to be more value added tax. Could you explain to generally what they mean by that, like a value added tax?
A value added tax is just a layered tax on sales, and it's administered in a slightly different way from a final sales tax, which we're familiar with in this country. But it's a very effective way to raise revenue. Because it's harder to evade than a final sales tax. But it is a very regressive tax, and one which is a huge burden on the consumer. European consumers are typically paying in the case of Greece, 24% on top of the price of practically anything they buy.
And that basically follows the mode of, in America, it seems like a lot of the tax burden is always placed on consumption. Like, maybe not always, but it seems like that's where it's been shifting over time. I don't know if that's, a side effect of multiple people, acting in different concerts. That's just an overall general effect of people wanting to push the tax burden onto consumption and how regressive that is, as opposed to how progressive, taxing, basically rents would be.
Yeah,
as
I mean,
like
we're somewhere in the middle in the United States. We have a pretty effective income tax, which is, for all of its flaws and problems and complexity, most of the American public is familiar with it, cooperates with it, so that it's possible for the U.S. federal government, anyway, to base itself on a at least substantially progressive tax base. Better than Europe, but not so good as if you really focused on taxing land.
So that's actually strange because you know, everybody has this preconceived notion when they come in, including myself. And I figured that the tax structure, for the most part, was highly unfair. But you're saying it does okay, for all its flaws.
Well, let's say I think that the income tax is, in fact, a remarkable American institution. The payroll tax is regressive. The sales taxes at the local level are regressive. And you have a problem in our country of the very decentralized structure. You have a lot of poorer towns that are, in fact, don't have the tax base either of incomes or, for that matter, sales. And so what do? They pile parking tickets on poor people. They do things of this kind. This was, in fact, one of the sources of the upheaval in Ferguson, Missouri, a year ago. A large part of the population was regarded the police correctly as an institution which was there to slap citations on them in order to raise revenue for the town. And that kind of that is sort of fundamentally unjust, fundamentally a very bad way to govern a city, and is likely to produce a huge, and this does produce a huge amount of well-justified resentment.
I think you hit a huge bell right there when, a lot of times people talk about economic decisions and kind of how it affects their lives. I think that's, first off, I think it's everywhere and it affects your life almost in everything that you do. But, a tangible result like that, where you say the police are basically seen as, instead of a service, a public service, they're seen as some sort of revenue engine to provide the city with needed revenue rather than, figuring out a way to solve their problems in another way, or maybe having support from the state or the county or something else. But that they're seen as basically a way to raise revenue, and it shouldn't be like that. And like you just said, it's a poor way to govern.
Yeah, no, I think that's correct, and of course it's obviously very unfair to police officers as well, because they generally consider their job to be public safety, and if they're being pressured to harass people, this is not helpful.
So now I know this is even like a leap for, we've been talking about just some common ideas: price control, wage controls, taxing rents. I want to move to, an area that you spent a lot of time in the End of Normal, when you talked about the financial crisis and like a lot of, why did the economics profession miss it? And then even when it was going on, why maybe the correct policy initiatives were not taken. And then even though the correct policy initiatives were not taken or they weren't done correctly, whichever it may have been, why do we still have to credit and say, well, at least the floor didn't fall out? Why didn't the floor fall out, since we didn't actually do the correct policy initiative, or it wasn't big enough, or whatever its faults may have been? Can you kind of go through that for us and, broad brush it for everybody? And, you don't have to get into minutia, but, just give us a good overview of that.
Well, let me just hit a couple of broad themes. I think the first thing to note about what happened in the United States in the crisis was that some basic institutions continued to function. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, food stamps, a whole range of things kicked in to replace incomes that a large number of people were losing. And this is a good thing. It helped to stabilize the whole economy and the society. But then there were other things that were done, I think, rather badly. And the most important one was that we basically allowed the banking sector to grow even bigger and more concentrated. And we put in some reforms in the form of the Dodd-Frank legislation, but these were have been very slow to take effect. They've been resisted effectively by the financial sector all the way through, and we've basically functioned to preserve the enormous concentration of power and wealth and influence that is in the hands of the largest American banks.
Let me ask you a quick
question.
question.
About that, but it's a fundamental imbalance of power and disregard for, let's say, norms of proper and ethical business conduct that brought on the crisis. There was a need for accountability, a need to prosecute criminal conduct that was not done, and a need to have a restructuring of those institutions that also didn't happen. So that, to me, are the two fundamental two sides of this particular story. Yes, some core institutions that were created in the 20th century continue to work pretty well. Did we really confront the problem that's at the core of American political power, which is the excessive power of the financial sector? No, we did not confront it. By not confronting it, we've made it worse.
Let me go back to something you said right in the middle of that. You said that the finance sector has grown large and disproportionately powerful. Why is that necessarily a bad thing for an economy?
Well, normally in an economy, you do want to have a decentralized decision making, some competition, some redundancy. You want businesses to be able to have multiple sources they can go to if they're looking for loans. And if you have an extraordinarily concentrated financial sector, what tends to happen is that you get an extraordinarily concentrated corporate sector as well. So you tend to have a lot fewer small businesses, independent proprietorships, the kind of mom and pop shops that used to be the major feature of the American economy tend to get taken over by things like franchise operations. And so you get a restructuring along the lines that's suited to the functioning of these major banking system sector. Another thing that happened was that with the very large banks going in heavily into the mortgage business, they started doing mortgages on a purely statistical basis, and you got the kind of gaming of that system, which produced the debacle of mortgage finance that led to the great crash in 2008, 2009. So there are all kinds of dysfunctions that happen when you allow large institutions to go completely out of control. And when they're too big when they're as big as they are, they become both too big effectively to manage and too big for the public sector effectively to regulate them. So you have all kinds of problems that are guaranteed to continue to crop up until something is done about the structure.
Wow, that is quite profound. I didn't actually see a correlation between having a concentrated finance sector leading us to have a concentrated corporate sector, on the other end. I never even saw the correlation. My thing was, I figured.
Yeah, if you have small and deconcentrated banks, you have small bankers. They tend to deal directly with small businesses. When you have large banks, they tend to like to deal with big corporate clients. So one of the things that, if you live in New York, you observe that there's an enormous number of coffee shops and that are owned by Halliburton and drugstores and so forth that have taken over a lot of small space that used to be occupied by small independent businesses. Why is that? Because landlords like corporations because they pay their rent on time. Banks like corporations because they pool risk and they can be counted on to more or less to pay their loans. That's you can see the convenience for large entities, but it's not a good thing for diversity and the quality of life in the community.
I see. Now, what reminded me, I had read your work a while ago, and not that too long, but just a little bit ago. But you recently signed the letter or you joined the list of 170 economists that had endorsed Bernie Sanders' financial regulation plan.
Yep.
And when that plan came under attack, you also issued a statement, or was it a letter, defending, or at least saying that, you know, what they were saying was, you know, at least not right. Could you talk about that letter, the original 170 endorsing Bernie Sanders' plan, and then the letter you wrote to the Bureau of Economic Statistics? I forgot what group it was you wrote that to.
Yeah, well, of course, the letter of 177 was to endorse the concepts behind Sanders' economic program, and that in particular had to do with his drive to hold Wall Street accountable and to restructure the financial sector. So this was, I think, a useful statement, and it was widely circulated. I think garnered some attention. I was pleased to see that. What then happened was in relation to a paper written by an independent academic, which gave an estimate of the overall growth effects of Sanders' economic program. I didn't necessarily agree with everything about that paper, but it was attacked in a rather, I thought, professionally discourteous way by four heavyweights who had been past chairs of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, who simply announced in a high-handed way that there are serious economists themselves and non-serious economists, and one shouldn't pay attention to the others, and that you should rely on the rigorous research of the serious people. And as a former executive director of the Joint Economic Committee, the counterpart to the Council of Economic Advisors, I felt I was in a position to respond to that, so I wrote them a letter saying, look, I think if you're going to talk about rigorous work, you should at least do some and show what it is that your actual problem with this paper was. And of course, they hadn't done so. They were just reacting, tossing off a couple of paragraphs in response to some conclusions that they didn't like. Ultimately, one of the former chairs did write a paper, which we then engaged in some argument about the merits of the two papers. But the initial action was not the way I think a professional should engage another professional. It should be based upon rank or past title, but on an actual argument that has something that you can read and examine.
Yeah, I believe when I read that, I looked at it and I was like, well, do they have any kind of, factual basis of just disregarding the work, or is it just like a straight disregard and there's nothing to really back up what they're saying? They didn't point to any actual errors.
They were just taking advantage of the fact that if you've got four chairs of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, you will get news coverage for that. And they didn't feel they had to do anything to justify their position or to underpin it. But they could just say, here we are, on the basis of our authority, this is our view, and they would get a headline out of that, which of course was correct. And to my mind, that is a form of professional dirty pool, frankly.
Yeah. James, I want to give you a second to speak about, so we know that, that empirically a lot of the policies that we see don't really produce the results that people claim them to produce. So let's say you could do anything. You were in charge of the American economy and you can do whatever you want. Or better yet, you were in charge of the world economy and you can do whatever you want. What kind of changes would you make?
Well, I would start delegating authority pretty quickly, because the concentration of power is precisely the problem. And I would ask, what is the golden parachute that people would be prepared to offer to get me out of that job? I think those would be the two rational things. No, but seriously, the most important steps that we can take are to provide democratic accountability for our economic institutions, to make it less true that aspects of our lives are governed in secret on the basis of how much financial power people have. And that's a problem in the United States. It's a problem in Europe. It's, of course, a problem everywhere. But the whole purpose of having democratic institutions is, in part, to bring excessive concentrations of power under control. And financial power is a particularly important target, a particularly insidious problem, because it's so often exercised in secret. So openness, transparency, accountability and responsible authority are the goals that I think citizens of a republic should have.
That's actually like an incredible way to say it. Those things alone would move us towards being able to get the solutions in place that we absolutely have to have. And the reason why I want to ask that question is because sometimes it's a little bit abstract from the normal person. Like, hey, we really don't know, X, Y, and Z, or all the technical terms, but we would really like to have a more accountable government, or we really like to have a more open process. And everybody says that, but we're really unclear like what kind of results it would have. But I think that it should be pretty clear that a more open process leads to less corruption. It counteracts that. Decentralization leads to less powerful entities being able to control things where they're so far removed from the decisions that they make that they can just make it and there's no accountability there or anything like that. They're just so powerful and they're gone. And I think that's kind of what you got going on in maybe the Eurozone or something like that, where you have a centralization of something and the people that are, basically living under those decisions are far removed from the actual decision-making process. But what I would like to say is this was actually a great interview. I really feel bad because for some reason on my end, I really couldn't hear as well. So I was really struggling to hear. I turned everything off in here, just complete silence so I can hear you speaking, but we'll work that out. And I would like to have you on maybe perhaps another time as you have time. I know you're a busy man, and we can probably take the discussion to a different area, preferably after I finish these next two books.
I'd be happy to join you. I apologize for this country phone line, but that's that's the offset for being in a remote part of the Vermont hills at the moment.
Oh, okay. I thought you had come back already. But either way, James, it's been great having you on. I would love to have you on again, and we have to end it so Ben can come on for the next show.
Okay. Thank you very much. Talk to you again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.